All right, welcome back to another edition of You Asked For It. I'm Matt. This is Todd. Todd, how are you doing today?
Marvelous.
You're a little more casual today than you are on a lot of our shows.
That's true. I decided I'd be casual today.
Okay. All right. So no explanation for that, just a decision.
It was a decision I made in my closet this morning.
All right. Well, good deal. Well, this week we have a very interesting question, one that you've been asked multiple times.
Yes.
And one that certainly people, critics maybe, of Scripture often ask. So what is our question?
So the question is this: how can we trust the Bible since it's been translated so many times? And I don't know if you've ever been asked that question, but I have, and maybe it's not that people directly address questions to me usually because I don't have a lot of answers. So, but it's more like in passing they will say this. They'll just make a statement out of it and say, "Well, you can't really believe the Bible's true because it's been translated so many times," or it's something I've run across online. That people have said.
Well, I mean, let's talk about that. I mean, there is some truth in that sentence. It has been translated
Absolutely
a lot. It's the most translated book in history.
Absolutely.
The Bible as a whole is now translated in some 700 different languages.
Yeah.
The New Testament has been translated to over 1,500 languages.
Yeah.
So
it's a lot of translations.
It's a lot of translations. And
well, I want to ask you a question as we get started here. Before we get, if you're,
I think we've already gotten started, but okay.
Okay. The question is this: have you ever played the game Telephone?
Well, I was going to get to that myself.
Oh, you were.
That's kind of the way we think about.
Okay.
I mean, it's kind of what Scripture. Some people would say that the translation of Scripture looks a lot like that. And for those of you unfamiliar with the telephone game, tell them what it is.
Yeah.
Tonight.
So the telephone game, if you've never played it, you should try. You have a group of people seated around in a circle, and the first person will come up with a statement, or maybe will be given a statement, just a one sentence or maybe two sentence statement, and that person will whisper it in the ear of the person next to them, and then that will continue around the circle. Each person whispering I believe just one time is all you're allowed to do it, and by the time it gets around to the other end of the circle, well, what happens?
It's usually not the same thing.
It's very different, right?
It's very seldom the same thing.
Yeah.
There is a Newsweek cover story that came out at one point called "The Bible So Misunderstood It's a Sin," and in it, the author Kurt Eichenwald, I think is how you say his name, he makes this comment: "No television preacher has ever read the Bible. Neither has any evangelical politician. Neither has the Pope, neither have I, and neither have you. At best, we've all read a bad translation, a translation of translations of translations, of hand-copied copies of copies of copies of copies, and on hundreds of times." Now, there are some statements in that are somewhat true.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I agree with Mr. Eichenwald when he says they are bad translations, and we'll talk about that as we talk today. But that is kind of what happens. I mean, if we talk about the history of how we have this thing called the Bible, indeed, we've not ever seen the original manuscript, correct?
That's right, and I mean, I think if we were going to do a fact check on Mr. Eichenwald, or however that name was said, it would be mixed is the answer, because some of it's true, which is usually how things come out. There's some truth, some error in there, and so I can't remember what you just asked me, but
how do we
get the Bible? Yeah.
None of us have actually read the original manuscript.
So how do we get this Bible, or whatever Bible you have? I mean, that's the question. How do we get this? Well, it certainly didn't fall out of heaven, in paper-bound, blue-printed cover. Let me tell you what a lot of people think, and this is what I almost hear being echoed in that Newsweek article, is that, so this started out and it was written in Hebrew, and then it was translated into Greek, and then it was translated from Greek to Syriac, and then from Syriac it was translated to Latin, and then from Latin it was translated to German, and then from German it finally made its way into English, and it just kept getting changed from language to language. Well, No, it didn't. And that's where we get into trouble with translation, because is this a translation? Well, yes, because the Bible wasn't written in English. But this is not a translation from German or from Latin or from any other modern language. It's a translation, because of what we have available to us, from some of the very earliest copies of the originals. And so what we have is any reputable translation, pretty much any translation you would buy in English off a shelf has been translated from the original manuscripts, which were written in Hebrew and Greek. And so the New Testament in Greek, the Old Testament in Hebrew with a little bit of Aramaic. And so to say that this is, that it's been translated so many times, yes, it has been translated so many times, but our Bibles today, the translators translated directly from the original languages. So it's really, if you want to say, well, it's been translated many times, well, it's not true. It's been translated, if we're reading it in English, it's been translated once.
Yeah.
If we're reading it like some of our viewers may be capable of, if they can read it in Greek, then they're reading something that hasn't been translated at all.
Right.
So
now, also he talks about it being copies of copies of copies. So let's address that a little bit, because if I were going to be critical of Scripture, therein is where I would raise criticism. Would be, we don't actually have the original manuscript that Paul wrote to the church of Corinth.
Yeah, that's right.
We don't have the original manuscripts of Moses penning first 5 books of the Bible. Right. So we are looking at copies of copies there. People like the scribes in the Old Testament, and probably some really smart people in the first 300 years or so of Christendom that were making copies, not translations. Yeah. So that's actually the case, right? I mean, that's...
Yeah, and we probably, wouldn't you guess that we only probably have, a few of those ancient copies that are surviving, right? We probably only got 2 or 3 of them, and so we're not sure, if those are accurate or right or not, correct? I mean,
that's what some people would think.
That's what some people would think, but it is absolutely not the case at all. Now, the tally on these changes all the time, but one figure I found in preparation to answer this question was 5,700.
That's a bunch.
5,700 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Now, those are not entire New Testament. Some of them are just a single book or a portion of a book. But you've got 5,700. Okay, so what that is, that's incredible, first of all, because...
No other book from antiquity has even close to that.
There's no ancient literature that we have that even approaches those kinds of numbers, first of all. But it's wonderful that we have that many, because what that allows us to do is it allows us to compare them and say, well, let's see how corrupted this is, these copies are. Let's see how much these scribes tinkered with them and doctored with them and changed them up, so we can see whether we can trust them or not. Well, it's been calculated. And this is not just, you choose your information. This is an accurate assessment, I would say. 99% of these manuscripts are in total agreement. That leaves a minimal amount of difference that pertains to, most of the time, to spelling, to word order that doesn't change the meaning, to just all manner of things that don't change the meaning of the text at all.
In fact, what I've heard is there's nothing that changes the meaning among those discrepancies.
I mean, there are some of these copies that have maybe a verse added or not there, but it doesn't affect any main doctrine of Christianity one way or the other. I mean, there might be a little bit added or left out in one of these copies, but again, by comparing these copies, almost in every case, we are so overwhelmed with the amount of information that it's absolutely clear what the original writing that the Bible author had written was.
And in fact, and even in those areas where there are some discrepancy, maybe a verse omitted or a verse added, most of our modern day translations will even address that in the footnotes.
That's right.
One of the ones that I remember distinctly is the woman caught in adultery in the book of Matthew, right? Is that Matthew? John.
Yeah.
Is not always, for years, particularly in the New King James Version, for instance, there would be a footnote that would said, that I think its exact wording was something along the lines of, this passage is not found in the earliest of manuscripts, meaning that, it looked like someone had possibly added it. Now, I did hear, and I haven't confirmed the story, but I did hear that as recent as in the last 12 to 24 months, they actually discovered an older manuscript, and that particular passage was in it. And so you could even see some of that, those footnotes changing because of that.
Mm-hmm.
And like Todd has already said, like you said earlier, not every manuscript that we have of those 5,700s is the complete. I doubt any of them are probably the complete, all 66 books. They may be, but I doubt that. Yeah. And so, sometimes we have omitted sections because we don't have that entire. Yeah. In that particular manuscript, we don't have the entire document or the entire manuscript. So.
Yeah, well, and it's the issue usually where something is omitted in our modern translations is because some of the most reliable manuscripts, the oldest ones, for example, may omit that, and some of the later ones have it, and so there's a little bit of a question there, But again, those don't affect any kind of major doctrine of any type, and so it's just that some of these passages there's a question because there is a difference in the manuscripts.
It's quite remarkable that we even have those. I mean, we struggle to keep up with newspaper. I mean, I have newspaper clippings from when I played football in high school. Yeah. That you struggle to keep up with, number one, and number two, they've already begun to fade. And the fact that we've got some manuscripts that were written in excess of 2,000 years ago. That have survived is remarkable.
And I was going to say something that's really, I think, incredible, just fantastic about these manuscripts. It's not just the number that we have, but it's also the interval between when they were written originally and the copies we have. Now, this is a thing to fact check me about because this may be old information. There may be something newer that's come out since then, but the Gospel of John most scholars would say was written between 90 and 95 AD. That's almost the year 100 AD, 100 years after Christ's birth. We have a manuscript fragment called the John Rylands Papyrus that dates from 125 AD. So you're talking about 30 years. We have a fragment of a document that dates from 30 years after it was originally written, which is absolutely amazing. I mean, that is very, very close.
No doubt.
And dates from the time when there would have been the next generation after the apostles would have been, there who knew the apostles personally.
Exactly. Yeah. So I do think that then we do see in that it's reliable, that our Bible, we can trust it because of the number that we have, the lack of discrepancy between that great a number of copies, and the fact that what we're reading now is a direct translation of those manuscripts, not passed through multiple translations.
That's right.
And maybe a way we conclude our time together, because I think that's adequate for answering that question, is even with that, though, it is fair to talk about different ways that our English texts have been translated. Because I don't know if the word reliable is the best word to use for that, but there are some translations that we think are better than others, not because we like the way they read, but because of the technique and the method that was used for translating those. And so talk about that just very briefly, how we translate. I mean, obviously you like New American Standard as your favorite version.
That's what I've got,
my preferred is either ESV. I also like the Net Bible, New English Translation. And I like the New King James, which is not one that I've used in a long time on stage.
Uh-huh.
And then Quentin sometimes likes the Message, which is kind of on
Right,
the other end of the
right.
spectrum
Sure.
from what we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
So talk a
Yeah.
little bit about those.
And before I just briefly touch on that, I would say that one of the evidences for the fact that this assertion that the Bible's been translated so many times is wrong. You compare any modern English translation, it's not like you're going to find much difference in any of those English. I mean, it'll be worded different, but the content is identical. And that is because it's not a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation. It's all these translators are going back to these Greek, these ancient manuscripts and working off the same page.
The seminary you actually attended was very involved with the net translation that I just said, right?
They were.
Was that happening some while you were actually in school there?
Yeah,
too?
I think that they were actually working on that. And it's been an ongoing thing, but they were wrapping up the initial translation while I was there. But anyway, just to Matt's question, what is the difference in these translations? So you've got some that are very strict and very literal in their translation of the original languages, and just kind of a word for word. And then as you go down the other end of the continuum, it's more of a thought for thought. So on this very literal end, the most literal thing you can get is something called an interlinear, which is it literally just writes out the Hebrew and the Greek in Hebrew and Greek, and then below it translates each word. It's a mess to read.
Hard to read.
Yeah, and the words are all out of order, but it's just about as literal as you get. Then right one click past that, a little more thought for thought, or a little more readable, would be what Matt mentioned. The New American Standard is what I have here. The ESV would fall in that category. The New King James, NKJV, would fall in that category. Then you go a little farther down and you run into the NIV, New International Version. Many are familiar with that. It's been a very popular version. You maybe go a little past that, right around there, you'd have the New Living Translation, NLT. I think around in that area you would have and there's new ones being produced all the time. The Christian Standard Bible, is that what it is? I think it used to be called the Holman Standard Bible. It's right in that area as well. And then as you continue down, you'll get to things like the Living Bible, the Old Living Bible. I don't know if that's still being printed, or the Message that you just mentioned. That's way over there. And again, it can bring fresh insights out of the text, but it's much more colloquial and much more of a thought for thought, and just kind of a representation of the big idea of the verse instead of the word for word.
And what you kind of mean in that is the further you get that direction, whichever way we want to say
right.
that, means that the translators took more liberty in telling us what the person meant that wrote it, rather than what they said.
Ultimately, they did more interpretation of what was.
You're getting a little bit of a commentary in that translation,
a little bit
as well.
Yeah.
I think that both have their place and both are helpful. The whole spectrum. There are times when in sermon prep, we look at what the Message says, because it does sometimes draw out colloquialism, like you said. But most of the time, we're going to be teaching from something just this side of the interlinear translation. Right. Although you and I both use that one as well, sometimes we just I use a digital version of that. A lot of times I'll use the Blue Letter Bible and their interlinear feature in there to see exactly how that's being said, to try to understand Scripture a little bit better.
Right.
So hopefully this has been helpful for you. If you have more questions about that, you can certainly reach out to me and Todd. Todd, his email address is toldham@discoverlifepoint.com. Mine's mbrooks@discoverlifepoint.com. And feel free to even comment in the questions of this post and ask more questions. Any last thoughts, Todd?
No, except that sometimes people will ask me, what is the best translation of the Bible? The best translation of the Bible is the one that you read. So
I agree. All right, have a great day. Thank you for joining us again on You Asked For It. We'll see you next time.